Hey everyone, this is group seminar week 6. We'll be talking about Jungian group therapy. And just again, as a brief overview, we're going to try and cover a couple of sections here, some overview and inception, history of the theory, some core concepts related to it, as well as discussing some of the differences in interventions and approaches compared to a interpersonal group style. As well as trying to take a social justice anti-racist frame, which will be an endeavor in some of these slides to come, but we're going to attempt to do that to discuss some of the complex history related to that. So the group theory seminar primary articles used for this, since this was not one of the theories listed in the 75th anniversary edition, but something I found in reading Justin Heck's article, Becoming Who We Are in Groups, when Jungian's approach to group psychotherapy, felt inspired to learn more about and to engage in what seemed like a different take or a unique perspective in Jungian group therapy. This is the first encounter that I had really with Jung when I discovered Heck's article last year. And since then, I've looked up more information on Jung, and there's a complex history with that, and we'll talk about that directly. I believe one of the seminal articles that's kind of mentioned that I'll use is from Farhad Dalal, who speaks about Jung, a racist, in the British Journal of Psychotherapy in 1988. So we'll discuss some of that history. And again, for me, this is a very important slide given this theory today. But group theories, as we'll come to discuss, tend to come from a more white supremacist Eurocentric origin. And that means that a lot of the theories, articles, and texts tend to be pretty colorblind, not referring to identity factors, leaving out really large variables in terms of socio-cultural context of the leaders, of the other members, which takes out a huge chunk of the speculative power dynamics and other aspects of the group that could be at play. So as I talk about things, I'll hopefully be able to speak to some of my own experiences and own identities in the socio-cultural transference that could be at play, and my intersectionality of my own stimulus value when providing the interventions to these theories. So take it from my perspective and not as a universal perspective on how to use parts of Jungian group therapy. And if I miss anything, or if you feel like there's other things that I should be considerate of, feel free to email me at the email listed below. So I wanted to speak to this first because this feels like, before I get to the too long, didn't watch summary, because this is not something I want to skip over. And I want to be upfront about this because I had a lot of conflict in when I was coming back to this. I was very excited to revisit this theory, and was able to consult with Justin for a bit, and that was really meaningful and helpful just to continue to gain additional context and perspective on how to introduce or utilize some of these concepts. And there was another article, I think it was a recent one, that I listed in the resources that spoke about being white and being Jungian, which I think is another good exploration of the conflict in using a theory that's clearly bases a lot of its foundational thought process and models on racist ideologies, racial hierarchies, and pretty blatantly and directly. If you read this article by Farhad Dalal, you'll see that there's a clear link by Jung's words directly. It's pretty blatant in terms of how he compares primitive, prehistoric with African, constantly goes out to other areas of the world, whether that's India, China, America, and kind of contrast the Europeans to non-Europeans in that way. And I think at the core of it, which is something, again, Farhad and his other works really highlights really well, is that he promotes individualism, and this concept of racial hierarchies gets based in something of a biological or genetic component. So valuing thoughts over emotions, respecting low emotional affect expression as with increased advancement of a group in that, you know, the logic and consciousness of the analytical side being something of an evolutionary like marker. And also does some strange things, like he speaks about the raw emotionality of the African man, and then appears surprised when he's more in tune with other people's emotions and with nature and other aspects. But it's clear in kind of the way that Jung describes it is he almost sees it as an evolutionary marker, like that literally these folks are don't have as many historical layers of development as the Europeans do. And so like kind of a literal hierarchy of where people will eventually evolve to be is where he is. And he also, you know, for me, who I hadn't mentioned this in the slides because I identify as white, and that's largely been my experience. But it got me thinking. I took a training with Lei Munois this past weekend, who did the documentary The Color of Fear on mindful facilitation of intergroup dialogues on race. And he asked a question about names and said, you know, you can come into this space however you'd like, but you know, no one knows you. And so if you want to try out a new name, you can. And so I changed my name to Malik, which is what people call me when I visit Algeria. And you know, this speaking, you know, to Jung's article, he also highlights Algerians are naturally criminal as well. So I felt some personal like frustration and stings for that. But I've had some reflections on how that was on the weekend to be called by that name. And I think there's several different reasons that popped into my mind as to like, why don't I ever use that or think about that? And part of me feels like I can't own it. Like it's not something I'm allowed to speak to because of, well, I haven't had experiences of direct racism, and that might be because that I introduced myself as Vinny or Vincent as opposed to Malik, which can sound more foreign, less white in that way, less acceptable. And you know, whether it's just wanting to really relish in that privilege that that part of my identity gives me, or feeling like I'll be seen as exploiting or kind of using that. It's sad because again, it takes me away from the cultural roots, which I've really been kind of numb to or not even interested in learning about until the last couple of years. So it speaks to me in terms of how the white culture, and you know, you read about this, but to me, I kind of started to realize that it's true, and in my experience, that it does make you give up a part of yourself. It makes you it almost encourages you to lose that curiosity, because if I have seen and I have heard of like my father going through racist attacks or accusations from white colleagues, especially around 9/11. And so there is a part that, again, the socio-cultural context that I grew up in was one where Arab, which is, you know, I'm from actually the indigenous Berber folks like in Algeria, but those are often conflated. It was given a very negative connotation, like, and so I can understand how, like, on that subconscious level, that socio-cultural narrative, or if you want to call it the collective social unconscious, like that does instill that message that you don't need to have that identity associated with you, and if it's away from you, then it's not a bad thing. It might actually be a positive. So just gets me thinking again about how all these things, these threads intersect with the way that we view ourselves in the world. And I hope that can be helpful for you all to reflect on as well. What part of this greater consciousness, social consciousness, is pulling on us in different ways to disown or maybe reject parts of ourselves. Dalal asks at the end of his article, is it possible to rescue the concepts of individuation and the collective unconscious from their racist antecedents? That's really hard. I would say it is possible, because as I thought about it, I was like, well, this is clearly very direct in terms of what Jung is doing. And I think, when I talked about modern analytic and the other psychoanalytic backgrounds, some of the articles highlight how all of those are also based in this dualism, this binary approach of like the inner and outer. And so they do have to be rethought of and reworked, maybe restated with different terms to make them less stigmatizing, less clinical, less tied to these backgrounds. But I think it's the awareness and approaching of these topics and these contradictions that's important for us. We need to be conscious of them and talk about it, and also consider what parts of these are parts that could be utilized in a way to promote change. I mean, when we think about it, a lot of our culture right now is based in white supremacy. So if we said we couldn't use any of it, I mean, there's certainly a lot of benefit in looking at more Afrocentric and other perspectives. And I think I hope to do a section on restorative justice practices from Morris Jenkins that highlights some of those approaches and features as well. But I would like to think of this less as an all or nothing, and that we can still find some use in these theories despite the limitations that they clearly have in their inception. So for the too long didn't watch summary, Jung talks about that humans are inherently predisposed to leave a mark on the world, to individuate, and again, very self-focused in that way. Work towards developing one's consciousness and unconscious minds to develop the optimal self-capacity. And Jung speaks about the unconscious as having other irreversible drives outside of aggression and sexuality, like one of kinship libido, one to be more artful, creative, to create bonds with others, which I think is a very useful way of reflecting on things outside of those primary drive theories. And also highlights the archetypal thoughts, the historical awareness, and the awareness of mythology as a way of almost having a cosmic view of one's problems, and a more connective thread to the narratives and stories of our ancestors and of our forefathers, that we're part of something larger, we're a drop in the river of history, and also we contribute to the flow of that. So in a way, I do like that some of the Jungian concepts, said differently, really connect with the concepts of interbeing from Thich Nhat Hanh that I've probably mentioned in previous presentations, but essentially that everything in this life and world is woven into one another, and that we all have different ties, whether we see them or not. A lot of the cultural and social context and culture that we're in tends to pull us away from another, or blind us from being able to see our interconnectedness, right? We only hurt strangers because they're strange to us. We don't see ourselves in them. And so if we start to use group as that tool to connect those threads, connect ourselves to one another's suffering, and really honor and become aware of that, I think that can be very meaningful, and kind of what we're looking for is that connection and acceptance. So Hecht has a lot of really great ways of framing these, I think, from a more progressive stance as well. So I encourage you to read his article to kind of get some vignettes particular to these, but speaks about the libido as a motivating force of all human endeavors. And so it's not just a sexual part in this way. It differentiates it in terms of, again, having more of that creativity, being relational to other people and expressing the potential for humanity, which I really love the term kinship libido. It feels very prevalent for me, in that I always do feel a certain desire and thrive for emotional connection. And I used to think that this was maybe just part of my like ADHD personally, but it does feel like maybe this is just, again, something more universal to our existence. It's just rather we're allowed to be in alignment with it, which, you know, Jung, as he talks about it, really speaks, and I think this goes for a lot of analytic theory, in which, like even object relations, if we talked about last week, the idea of breaking away from the mother or breaking away from dependency is like the progress sign, which I think that's part of the culture that I would question and challenge, in that the idea that we need to be an individual who stands on their own, like defining their destiny. Again, a very concrete version of the self, whereas I kind of feel like the more Buddhist view of self would highlight, well, there isn't really a self like that, or the boundaries aren't so clear between you and I. And so my individuation may not be me as an individual, maybe me like joining in and being a part of something greater than just myself, not necessarily fulfilling a unique destiny and opening up a, I don't know, a coffee shop in a small town or what have you. So these unconscious drives, again, there's something underneath us that's really pulling us to fulfill our unique destiny. There's another book that I was reading, and I can't quite remember the name of it, The Middle Path, I believe, which I agree with some of the aspects of the frame and setup, but not a lot with the execution of that book. It does talk about a theory similar to the string theory that I kind of proposed in the Gestalt Buddhist informed group therapy model, meaning that like we all start like pretty pure. I think Dalal speaks to this in the developmental perspective of, you know, we start pure at birth, and you know, we don't hate ourselves, we don't think of ourselves as less than, or feel we have a not a right to be angry, not a right to express our needs, to be dependent on another. But then there's all these like rules and, you know, societal and cultural norms that become the binary strings that attach to us and pull us to twist and creatively adjust to our environments. And so like the way Jung speaks about it, or at least the way that I understand it, is they see that more as like institutions like that hold those expectations. So they talk about like the institution of marriage, the institution of like being a father, being a, you know, I would argue again, like you should expand this to be more the cultural, social context. So what it means to be a Black man, what it means to be a Hispanic like woman, an international student, like what are the expectations that are telling you that you need to fall in line in this certain way? And you know, where I have students all the time who will talk about not being able to express themselves because it's not okay in higher ed to talk this way. It's not okay to speak to their professor like in this way, or there's a perfectionistic expectation of the system that they get this work done in this amount of time. And you know, life or other things like aren't important to acknowledge. If you're having family stuff, that's not going to be, you know, considered. So part of that, I think, again, is like that's what I see as us feeling like held back and constricted and wanting to individuate in that way. When we talk about, I know I've jumped a little bit ahead with individuation in some sense, but these feel kind of interrelated in some ways. But to highlight the idea of us like working with the concept of libido, though, and I think it's really helpful again to think of this as how do I affirm goal-directed and life-affirming behaviors, like encouraging people to be spontaneous, creative, lighthearted, and in the sense, like just having fun and being able to enhance the energy in the group, rather than thinking of it as a resistance or something that is like not okay to do, or that is hiding something else. I mean, again, I think both could be true, right? The group could be avoidant of some like difficult emotions in the room, and we don't have to take that as a bad thing, right? We can approach that with equanimity and say, that's what the group needs right now, and how can I like promote this, like you know, this behavior that would not be acceptable outside of the group space, right? Because if they feel very constricted in terms of how they're able to express their love and care for one another, and they're starting to gush about each other and starting to talk about fantasies of writing each other love notes or like sending them mail like after they leave this group together, then I think that's like a thing that's fun and lighthearted and kind of speaks to the excitement and energy you want to kindle in this. So outside of that, there's also importance in terms of like when we speak about sexual attraction. This is something that seems akin to Lacanian like group therapy, and in terms of it's not so much the demand, but what's the desire or the lack of something that's behind it. And so when you have somebody that's attracted to somebody in group, maybe they start with just the physical, but then we also want to be curious about what do they represent? What parts of this person, like why them? In one of the sessions that I've had, somebody, like I'll be vague on the descriptors, but somebody had a very intimate dream with another member in one of my groups, and it was very difficult to share and very embarrassing and brave of them, and also like it would allowed us in the group to be able to speak to like, well, why this member, why like what about their relationship thus far has made that maybe make sense, or what could they represent that they're not feeling fulfilled in outside of the group process. And so that was really meaningful, again, because then you get past the personalization of it as to this is what it means. It means that I'm attracted to this person and want to be with them, and rather you think about like, well, it's actually because of their autonomy, their emotional connectivity, their warmth, and their holding presence that all feels like something that that maybe is missing in their lives otherwise. So just as an example with that. And again, they speak about it as the group as a representation to form collectives, which I think would be what Jung would call primitive, and I would call like human, like centric, right? And very much almost essential to us, right? We're collectivistic, and we live in groups, we live and breathe in groups, even though we try to focus on separateness. So this kind of seems like it contrasts Jung's view of individuation, and I think this could be part of what we would need to consider, is that it's not about a separation from humanity, but more like how do we find ourselves and the parts that we've had to reject or compromise and find them in others so that we can promote that in ourselves. So, and next we'll focus on individuation. Individuation is a sense of finding a sense of yourself, and again, like in terms of what this looks like, it's coming at it from a very self-focused perspective and a very concrete self-focused perspective. There's a story in the book, The Middle Path, that really, I think, highlights the argument and the like white supremacist like flaw of this foundational piece, because it speaks to things that are similar to the ideas of again what I spoke about last time, but it says like institutions hold us to these expectations as a father, again, and we could expand those to be your cultural identities, your social identities in this context. But then like the adage that comes up is, because there's not an interpersonal courage or bravery to break from that, then like you're stuck to suffer in that piece. And they use this famous poem or story. I'm sure I won't be saying it exactly as it's written, and I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but that story that says, like, I walk down a road, I fall in a hole, I walk down a road, I fall in a hole again. I walk down a road, I fall in a hole, but I see the hole as I'm falling in, and so it's my fault, which the problem with this metaphor, like, of falling into the hole, and again, like, is to say, like, oh, I fall in the hole, but I see it, and so it's my fault. Again, it places this idea of the individual, like, with enough willpower and courage and wherewithal, can overcome a systemic flaw. And again, it's very individualistic in that way. And as the poem kind of continues, it says, like, I fall in the pit, but then, like, I maybe try and get myself out, or I try to walk around the hole. And then eventually it ends with them saying, like, I'm walking down the street, I see a hole, I go down another street. And again, like, the metaphor, like, kind of speaks to this, like, you choose differently to not fall into the pit of the systemic expectation. And again, there's a sense of, like, well, just go down another street, and as if, like, there's not other holes on those streets. And why are there only holes for you as this, a person of color, as opposed to other folks? Could we look at this metaphor more as wanting us to create a system in which, like, we see the hole, the community also sees there's a hole that we keep falling into, and we help fill it, like, for one another, right? Like, that is, I think, what would be a better way of reflecting on, your getting to your goal, but through the shared space of community and encouragement, which I think actually Hecht does a really good job just in talking about that, in terms of the group members being the system and the support that the person did not have previously to be able to individuate. Because there's a reason why we adapt to the ways that we do. We say fall in the hole as if it's all pain and suffering and problematic, and it's not that. I think it's a good thing, right? That, like, let's say women aren't allowed to, or have a very thin line of where they can be assertive and not, like, considered like too emotional. They have to be, like, very constricted in that. And because of the system's expectations and the ways that people navigate it, this was adaptive. This is what you had to do throughout your life up until this point of your raised consciousness to be able to survive. And so really wanting to still honor that the whole was protective, like, not something that was just needless suffering that you could have just avoided if you had just been more like yourself. Because again, it highlights the idea that the system's really, there's consequences for these things. And whether that's losing your career, or again, taking all these steps, if you don't feel like you have support around you to do that, or if you are constantly giving messages from your family and community that this is not okay, you can't change your career, you can't just pick up art. Like Justin talks about an example where someone wanted to quit, like, maybe a more mainstream job and go to something more artistically in a nonprofit sector, and was more artistic in nature, I believe. And the group were those strings of support, So again, like, in my metaphor, I would say those strings of the oppressive roles, whether it's like the husband or the society of, like, a man's supposed to provide, and like those were pulling at them and reinforced by the family system. And this different system, like, it was able to actually support them and give them a different vision of what could be. In one of my process groups, one of the members talked about it being like, you get these voices in your head from the systems, the families, the social cultural norms that you grow up in, and they kind of become your committee that tells you what's right and what's wrong. And they framed it as their itty bitty shitty committee. And so, now they're replacing some of the board members of that committee with the group members in here. You're starting to gain a sense that this is actually not how it has to be. It's, you can like create and move towards systems that can support you, rather than saying, like, it's your fault for not being motivated enough to, like, make that choice. because again, I wouldn't fault anybody for restricting their affect and cutting off a part of themselves at work if the consequence of that is that they'll be fired, and the reason that they do it is to support their family. That's a very complex and nuanced thing, and it's easy to feel stuck. And I think part of what the beauty of group is you can really have an experience that's reparative in that way and provides maybe people who are in different levels of their own journeys, right? In this story, somebody who has left the relationship, somebody who has quit a job and changed careers, so that you can see a future part of yourself in them, or they can speak to their past selves in you. And that again is, I think, is like more of the archetypes and the connections in this Jungian sense, where you can really have a sense of something greater, not that you're going to follow the exact same path, but that there is like perspective and hope with that. So I really like that in terms of, again, the ways in which they want to highlight how can you gain support for your growth individually, but not disconnecting it from your community and gaining support and being dependent on different people for different needs, for different systems to fill different needs. So yeah, system of oppression, denying our inner processes is kind of how I would frame it. And again, causing each of us to lack something which we're not allowed to be or strive towards being in that. Oops. And so next we'll speak to fostering individuation in group, just with a little few more examples. So focusing on the vulnerability and visions, again, from more the early childhood experiences and how they impact us. Again, I would say in terms of like, how did we adapt from our previous experiences to be able to make it by in this world that we're living in now. So instead of thinking of our emotions as the problem, thinking of that as more like what we needed to do or how we needed to act in order to get by. And that, again, like having that non-discrimination approach that if I was you and being raised in that same socio-cultural system, then I would be doing that too. And so like, this isn't about changing you as an individual, but providing you the additional strings to help hold you up or to guide you towards a different way of being, which I think you can do really wonderfully through the group process. So let's try and talk about ego self-access. You can tell that I'm really feeling like I'm very going to confidently speak to this. Just based on that picture, you can see it's a very simple, understandable process. But if I had to try and give some frame for this, the persona is like the persona that you put out into the world, your social self. And again, I would say like that's the creative adjustments part of you that's had to adapt to the systems that you're in. And so if that's, for me, I have a different persona, how I am with my partner than I am as a professional, than I am with like my close friend back in middle school. And so that, is part of the things that I have to sacrifice or cut away of me, like depending on the socio-cultural context that I'm in. And it's not embodying my true self, like in that sense, like my larger self. Now, Jung talks very contrivedly, like it's just very not clear in terms of he uses the self in a lot of different ways. But the capital S self can be kind of spoken to in this sense of like an inner source of like divine inspiration and wisdom, which again, like from a Buddhist psychology perspective, kind of I can resonate with the idea of like a purity and a self that again deserves the acceptance, care, love, isn't wrong for feeling or thinking or being what it is, because again, like we don't blame the flower for not thriving in the drought, right? Like sometimes we may act in certain ways, and that's largely because of what the systems and the binary rules that we've associated have told us we have to act like, or we should act like to be good, to be okay. So that more interconnected self, that divine self, is something that's like it seems like connects all of us through this like collective unconscious, or this thread. And the goal is to hopefully have the creative energy and the life force of your inner psyche be healthy, life-affirming, and like, self and life-affirming purposes. Like sometimes they speak to this in terms of like, this can often lead to you contributing to something greater than yourself, which again, like I think if we get towards this aspect of interbeing as opposed to individualism, which Jung, I think, is more on the individualistic side in some sense, like when he's speaking about all these like theoretical foundations, then yeah, when we help someone else, we can have that sympathetic joy, right? We can feel the joy in creating the joy in others, and not have it be like a self-focused, like in my respect, because we are connected in that way. We can all like recognize that when one of us suffers, we suffer. Like even in terms of like our racial dialogues, when we talk about white and Black identities, one person is the one being harmed in that clearly, and we as white folks like may jettison off, reject, like rip off a part of ourselves, a part of our sense to be able to connect, to empathize, to be in contact with the suffering of others. And that's the adaptations that these systems have pulled us away from. And so again, I think there are ways in which you can highlight the connection from your ego and like this individual part of you to the interconnectedness of the greater whole and social consciousness, social unconscious in that way. So when we talk about working with the ego self-access, this is again fostering the awareness of non-rational consciousness states, which I feel they're talking about emotions. Again, I could be really like just coming at it from my frame of reference, but that's what I think of when we think of non-rational consciousness states and develop a relationship between them. Jung also had, again, these very like negativistic binary labels, which again, I think perpetuates society in terms of what it means to like feel is usually seen as a negative. Like if you're feeling overwhelmed with sadness or anger or grief, like that is primitive in that way, rather than naturalistic, like for us. So trying to promote that awareness of your emotions, I think, is really like makes sense, and understand like when you have like dreams or kind of like different visions, that those have meaning, they have power, they deserve respect, curiosity. And I think again, like I like the idea of if you replace visions with emotions as well, to think like those emotions are adaptive, they're powerful, deserve respect and curiosity. It's more of a like EFT approach to emotion-focused work, while being balanced in practical applications as well. Justin talks about this like more from the vision standpoint of a woman who has all these backgrounds into transpersonal psychology and more existentialism, and it gets very heady and very in the clouds, and kind of speaks to that as like a spiritual bypass in which we use our spirituality or our cosmic view to get away from the pragmatic, practical, like problems in the here and now. And so like sometimes the group can be used to rein someone in to like what they're like avoiding in the present moment. And other times the group can be used to expand or to zoom out to that cosmic view of like, how is this something that's familiar to you in your life previously that's happening right now? So we can have that like, kind of narrative continuation, as well as like how this connects to other maybe archetypes or ideas in your life. So amplification is kind of used in terms of like dream images and where the group members generate their ideas, thoughts, feelings, mythological references, particular pieces of art. I've had other folks talk about dreams in group, and something like I woke up and I saw a golden retriever, and it wasn't mine, and it wasn't my partner's, or it wasn't like anyone in the houses, but it was there for me, and like it was happy to see me, and I was young again, and I was walking out like from like a room with the dog next to me, like, and people just kind of generating, what could that mean? Is that like this idealistic view of like what life's supposed to be, and what this like idealism of America gives us in terms of like, you get your eternal youth, you get your golden lab, your, partner, 2.5 kids, and like the kinds of images, again, none of them actually being wrong or right in that way, but more to generate and to breed curiosity and openness to letting, how do we make sense of that and internalize the meanings for these to us, which again, I think is really harkens back to some like spirituality beliefs with more cultures that are typically not like considered European, whether that's like, you know, the like focused on like more Afrocentric or other kinds of native indigenous people like within the US or outside of the US. So I think that can be a very fascinating way to incorporate that as well. And so the problem with opposites in the transcendent function, this is kind of focused on what I would say feels gestalty in terms of its flavor. In terms of, well, Jung speaks about it from the idea of arising from the union of conscious and unconscious content, which again, I think pragmatically, how I would try and like frame that is less about, oh, your unconscious is the problem, because Jung, again, in this sense, makes it seem like the unconscious is something that we can control, and we can, like, through our intellect and our power and like our individual like empowerment, we can like kind of grasp hold of all the strings that have bound us from the systems that we're in and move wherever we want. And I would say that that's very idealistic to say that like you can remove yourself from the socio-cultural context of which you are and be your true self. You know, there are so many things that can hold us back from being able to thrive or to live in that way in this world. And I think, you know, it's a good thing to move towards, of course, like more of that authentic self. I think that's part of what we're really wanting to empower, is that actually how you are, how you identify, or how you want to act, you think, you feel, like that is okay. That is not dependent on these strings, but to ignore them and say that like you need to be the one to grasp them and rip away from them. I think it puts so much onus on the self, which can be a lot of unfair individualistic expectation for all the systems that are at play. So rather than doing that, what I think you can speak to again is this holding on to dialectic paradoxes of seemingly like different contradictory parts of your personality. So this Gestalt flavor that I mentioned is like, you know, we have all parts of us in these things. And so if there's a part of me that's really assertive, and then there's a part of me that's like non-assertive or passive. And if there's a part of me that's like very selfless and that like I give, and like, then there's another part of me, shadow part of me, as like Jung would call it, that is selfish, that I want to reject, that I say is not okay for me to be. And again, if I think about that from my frame, when I think of my family and things that I like, you know, labeled my certain parental figures as, I would say one was being selfish, and I didn't like that, and I didn't want to be that, and so I internalized that to be, this is not okay for me to be. And so I move through life in such a way to reject that shadowy part of me. And part of what group is doing is trying to have us understand that that part of us is actually okay. That's actually normal, and it's not something that should be cast in the shadow or seen as a negative, which I think there is something like positive about that. You know, I think there's implications again with like shadow or something darker of a side of you, and having that white and black like contrast that can be problematic. But I feel that, again, being able to say that we have complexity to us and we're nuanced, and we have, we're not all or nothing people. We're not good and bad people. We're always somewhere in the between, like of that, and fluctuating, I think is a very realistic and helpful thing to bring to the group. In fact, when we talk about it from like modern analytic or other lenses, oftentimes how we like talk about if interventions are successful is to say, are we seeing a different side of this person we haven't seen before? Is the group having a new relationship to them in which they haven't had previously? Kind of again, like we have this very simplistic one-way view of somebody, and then they slowly, as we like see them, our projections of who they are, we think they remind us of, they differentiate and they become a unique person in front of us. And so we're doing that kind of within ourselves as well, right? Like recognizing that we do have these parts, and that actually through the group process, we can be accepted and give them compassion for those parts that we see as contradictory, you know, horrible, evil, wrong, sinful. So some good things I think to highlight in terms of how that can be beneficial for us to use. So the either or dichotomies, like I said, that good, bad binaries, especially when it comes to emotional experiences. Developing patience and curiosities when you have dilemma. Justin spoke about this example, I believe, hopefully, in which he kind of highlights someone having a frustration or a desire to be someone different in the future. And he asks two different group members in the group to hold on to the different visions that this person has, whether it's like staying towards the path of being like a person, a family man who doesn't venture off and kind of stays at home, you know, committed to his family, and you know, stays in that relationship even though there's like tension and suffering in that. And then also another member kind of represents and would like speak to and kind of mentalize what it might be like for that member to be more dynamic, to move to Japan, to a different part of the world, to rediscover themselves, and like the also the complexity of that too, not just the joy, but the uncertainty and the fear. And so you kind of have like two members that are mentalizing what it might be like for this person to stay or to leave, but both of them are presenting the two visions so that the group can kind of bear witness to those two like choice points or fork in the road that are in front of this person, which I think is a really cool like way to use the group in a dynamic way to visualize the internal dilemmas, you know, and the discovery that can take place in that, not with an expectation that you solve it, because a lot of this, like in the Gestalt frame, I think is more about holding the paradoxes rather than feeling like I need one or the other. You know, we suffer no matter what in life, right? It's like different suffering, but suffering is going to happen. It's universal. And so how can we move towards like the suffering that's going to meet our inner values and what is meaningful for us, not with a sense that this is the better or the right option, but this is the option that I'm choosing based on my current needs, my current values, the systems that I'm in right now. So yeah, how else could we see the situation? What's another way of looking at it? You know, just really trying to diversify the simplicity if it feels like very rigid in terms of the one way that people are approaching it. This alchemical approach to transference is going to sound very strange. I do find it fascinating. And again, like it feels more spiritual kind of in nature to say like, well, Jung is quoted as saying the analysis cannot be said to have begun until the analyst and patient have become a problem for one another. And so Justin, I think, kind of expands this idea, and he says the alchemical process is like really contrived and confusing. It's more like of the more abstract concepts that Jung speaks to. But it also kind of speaks to the idea of like boundaries being loosened and being able to cross the boundaries with the other person and allowing yourself to have more of this encounter process. Again, like feels kind of in Gestalt frame in some sense, where you can encounter, you can like form some intimacy and like interweave your threads together to be able to allow visions or allow things that come into your mind to speak to them and to say, you know, if a song comes to your mind when a client is speaking and that's something that's meaningful for you, and it's you obviously have like maybe some connection to that song emotionally or otherwise, then you can speak to that in this process. So therapist merges with each individual group member sequentially, and then with the energy of the group as a whole. You know, the last week's section on the omnipotent child actually kind of talks about this in some ways, like recreating this mother-child dynamic and merging through the metaphor of the lap and having that be something that's done with each individual person, which I think is, again, a fascinating like metaphor and strategy you could consider, like with very like delicate intentionality around its use. But I've done this and had people like, you know, be curious about the images, songs, art that comes to mind. And like even just somebody in group had mentioned one of their favorite movies was The Sound of Music, which I like many people hadn't seen in the group. And so when they were explaining why it was meaningful or like what the plot was about, they actually didn't know why it was meaningful. It was just one of their favorite movies, and they never really thought about why. And so when they did that, then they started to see like, oh, actually the archetype and the way that this person like progresses in their life to have like nothing, to build up to something, to have nothing again, like it's kind of like a similar archetype to her own story and her own tragedy in some ways, or like empowerment in other ways. So it was a really fascinating method of, kind of expanding the conversation. Justin talks about like speaking to, not directly, but just when someone's talking and they're kind of feeding this line about this misogynistic view that he kind of had this vision of a china plate with excrement on it. Like I'm this very professional, nice looking man, and I have these really horrid views. And he didn't share that exact like picture in his mind with the client, from what I understand, but still tried to speak to it in a way to highlight the intense disgust that was being felt like by what he was dishing out to the people. And also talked about, as somebody was speaking and feeling in a fog, getting caught in looking outside and seeing the fog of the bay, and speaking to that in the moment. I think it's very cool. And there's a lot of things that I reflect on now where I'm thinking about my favorite movie, which was Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and why that was my favorite for so long, and what it meant to me, and what about the characters or the like journeys did I connect with in that, as well as like my favorite games like Psychonauts or other things that you may connect with in terms of your music. We had a group that was trying to support somebody who was about to do their dissertation and defense in the past, and had all given their songs that they felt were meaningful to empower them, and spoke about why those songs were meaningful and powerful, and created a little playlist and sent it to the group to be able to have that part of one another. So you can get creative. And again, I like the creativity in these things because it makes group therapy feel not so like one way in terms of how we have to be or should be. And so like with these archetypes and collective unconscious, again, these are more the ancient eternal myths that guide humanity and inspire us. There's a sense that archetypes are universal and cut across cultures and throughout history, which I think is fascinating to consider in terms of like how these things could transcend language and communication in that way. And they speak to more of the emotional, I think, and humanistic needs that we all have to be loved, accepted, to feel like able to overcome adversity in that way. And so focusing on, again, like, who am I? What's my purpose in life? What am I working towards? And if I have like a history of, being more for social justice, LGBTQ plus rights, then the group leader might like connect that with, reminding them of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and justice, or how they're connecting that. Just to provide, in my mind, it's more like, how do I make the purposeless emotional suffering in my life more purposeful by highlighting how these journeys have led to something greater and led to, empower the hero or the person that was there. But again, like, not to be caught in this idea that it's the hero alone, that the hero is always held up by those around them in some ways, right? So mix of then and there and here and now, asking why are you a part of this activity, this sport, this music, and then highlighting the broader historic context for your individual experience. And then again, the group members just being curious, opening up multiple perspectives as to why they might be doing this. What's a purpose, the person's cosmic purpose outside of that, and how can we be like focused less on ourselves and more focused on the benefit and how we change this garbage suffering moment into that fertilizer, right, for our future growth and development. So you want to hold on to the individual polarity versus the universal. You want to be curious and validate the courage that it takes to defy conventional behavior, while not getting too far into narcissism and ego inflation. And again, focusing on understanding the role of spiritual and religious life in the clients, which I think is not as much talked about in different spaces, and focusing on your self-disclosure, your vulnerability, your willingness to go to different difficult emotional spaces that all things are welcome and accepted, and modeling that transcendent function through your own patience and compassion, multi-directed partiality through anger and sadness, like allowing people to feel what they feel in these spaces. Last thing I'll mention, it's very cool. And if you want to look it up on your own, there's 11 maxims to dream interpretation that Hall gives, which is a very cool, I guess, offshoot of Jung's theory of like fantasies and daydreams. It's just a helpful guide, I think, in terms of like getting concrete steps to say like the night before group. If you write in detail the dreams that you had before you awoke, or as soon as you do awake, describe the clarity and context of the dream, the sequence of events, the dreamer's feelings of the dream image, if the dream's repetitive, what their role is, and then amplifying the associations, like we said, from group members. And then again, doing that personal, cultural, archetypal associations that come to mind, as well as like assimilate. So zooming in to make conscious sense of the dream, and then and kind of zooming out, right, to that more cosmic perspective. So focusing on how do we make this just a subjective curiosity for us to unpeel. And yeah, giving you some questions and guides for that. So thank you all for walking through that, and I hope that can continue to provide some perspectives on how we can adapt these theories that have very difficult origins to consolidate in some sense. But my hope again is that you can not take this as a whole, but use parts that make sense and integrate into your own style, so we can use the unique contributions of these and build upon them to something that is more equitable and inclusive.